few weeks ago. And for those of you who might not be as familiar with CockroachDB, we have two major releases a year. So we have our spring release and our fall release. And more recently, as our cloud products have gone into maturity, we also do monthly releases to our cloud products. So this release, our fall release, we really have some super exciting updates here. And they fall into these three main buckets. So the first is improvements to our CDC functionality. And the second is really focused on the developer experience with CockroachDB. So a lot of great updates there. And the last one is all about operating more easily at massive scales. So Michael, from your perspective from the product team, can you kind of give us an overview of why we focused on these general areas for this release?
Yeah, at a high level, I think we're always focusing on the developer experience. How can we create a database product that, rather than creating more problems for you, helps unblock and unburden you in that development process? So a lot of the tools that we do in terms of integrations with the architectures and the tools you prefer, uncorking performance problems or query optimization issues, and frankly, making it so you don't have to think about the scale of your database is really something that we focus on in terms of unblocking that development process. And at this point, we've been building the product for 7 years now. We have lots of customers. We've accumulated a lot of feedback, and they're operating, a lot of these customers are operating at massive scale and pushing the limits. And so we're really focusing on enabling that as sort of not just a differentiator for us, but a value add for you as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point that, we've been building for 7 years. Our database has reached a certain level of maturity where we're happy with a lot of our core functionality, but then we need to continue to improve in these other adjacent areas.
That's right.
So I think that's a great segue into the first bucket of updates, which is all around improving CDC and CockroachDB. So for those of the people on the call who might not be as familiar, could you just give an overview of what CDC is and what the value of it is for our users?
Sure. So CDC stands for Change Data Capture, and it's a native functionality in CockroachDB that allows you to push changes on tables that you're watching out to sinks that are sitting external to the database. So a Kafka instance somewhere, S3, and new in 21.2, a webhook style sync. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of use cases for this that we'll dive into in a sec. But at a very high level, anything where you have streaming to a data warehouse or triggering events based off those streams are things that we see in the market.
And can you talk about some of those common use cases that we see our customers using?
Sure. I think, again, it runs the gamut here, but two very specific examples. We have a customer who's using CDC to stream data to a third-party service that is watching for those changes on that table and then triggering a configuration change on a mobile application. So the mobile application is a separate service from their primary service, and they're using CDC as the way to get low latency updates to the mobile application itself. And we also see another common use case that we see is streaming data to Elasticsearch. So making sure that as orders into a commerce platform are coming in, a user can very quickly and easily search against that. And so really low latency updates to that search index.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot of customers who are using CDC talking about it as being one of the top features in CockroachDB, or one of the golden features in CockroachDB. And I know it does exist in other databases, not all of them, but what are some of the differentiators that make CDC and CockroachDB so special?
Yeah, I think one of the big things is that we chose to build it natively into CockroachDB. A lot of third-party providers, what they do is they utilize the transaction logs, and they have a third-party system or service that is able to parse that into data. I think with the distributed database, that was going to be a lot more difficult to provide that single stream. And so one of the benefits is that it's tightly coupled and integrated with the product, but also, the native integrations that allow you to write directly to Kafka, to write now directly to a webhook sync that you've set up, and soon expanding into new tools as well, is one of the main benefits that's there. And I think the other thing that's great here is that it has all of the distributed benefits of CockroachDB as well. And we've actually had a few instances of customers overloading their Kafka clusters downstream because they were able to write so much data into CockroachDB that we were streaming too much data to their Kafka clusters, and they had to scale that up pretty hard.
Yeah, that's great. Well, not great, but it's great that Cockroach is streaming that much data. So yeah, I think that, in order to be a truly distributed database, these other features and functionality, they need to be distributed as well. So whether that's CDC or backup and restore, which we'll get into later, those are things that you have to have for the database to be truly distributed. So for this release for 21.2, what were the updates we made? Some of them are obviously on the slide here, but what do we change? Why did we focus on those updates? Why is it valuable for customers and prospects and users?
Yeah, I think at a high level, right, it's similar themes of we want to meet where you are with the tools that you love, and create a product that you really ideally are not having to think about it on a day-to-day basis, right? It runs, it lets you know when something's wrong, if there's something wrong, and there's an easy way to remedy it. And I think also running at the scale you want. So in terms of meeting you where you are with the tools you want, the webhook sync was there really to ensure that sort of a long tail of syncs out there, or you have a service that specifically is just listening to specific types of messages, are there, right? So you can spin up a little webhook server and do something with the data that's coming in there. And this allowed us to have a long tail of interoperability with the tools that are out there in the market. In terms of scalability, like we said, CDC is interesting by nature because its reliability is also contingent on the reliability of external systems. And as we are able to scale the messages out, how do we deal with the fact that we might overload an external system? And so these are sort of problems that we're working to address in large part so that you're being alerted to something that may need attention as opposed to alerting to something that's where it's already gone awry. And I think that dovetails into monitoring as well. I think change feeds are meant ideally to run forever. And so the proper monitoring is really important to that sort of holistic user experience here. And so also to a similar thing we talked about earlier, like the core capabilities were strong. We're adding sort of the usability, making it, iterating on it to make it a more integrated part of that developer experience, but also one where the sort of operational burden is lessened as well.
Cool, thank you. So I know you also have a demo prepared for us of the webhook. So you want to go ahead and present that? I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll pass it over to you to wow us with the new webhook.
Sure. So this is what I've set up here is just a really quick demo. So you'll see I have a single node Cockroach database set up here. And I have a little script that I set up that creates a little webhook server on my local machine that it's really quite simple. I think it'll just print out whatever messages are written to it. So I'm coming over here, logging into the SQL shell, I think, and then creating a change feed, which is the command to create a CDC stream on a table foo that I already created. And you'll see here that the data that was already in the table was emitted back out into the webhook server, right? And I'm going to insert some data into this table foo, and you'll see that's also printed out here. I created this change feed with a few options. One is called updated. What that does is it makes sure that in the messages that are emitted, you'll see this is the commit timestamp within our database, so you can see when that data was committed. And then additionally, I use the resolved option. And what the resolved option says is that up to this timestamp, and right now it's epoch timestamp, it is all the commits up to that timestamp for this table have been emitted. So these are just some tools to let you know, sort of track the state of what's been emitted, but also sort of use this data downstream. Right now, the webhook server is HTTPS only and also JSON as an output format only, but like we said, it's in beta. So we are more than eager to have you try it out and give us some feedback and iterate on it and provide, issues into our public GitHub repo for potential future improvements.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, and I think that's just goes for all the features in the new release, or just in general. We love hearing from you. We love if you see something that you think needs to change, or just post in our community Slack, file an issue in GitHub. We are always looking for that. So I'm gonna go back and present my slides again. All right, you can see my slides, right, Michael?
Yes.
Cool. So let's move on to the second bucket of updates, which is all about improving the developer experience of CockroachDB. So for those of you who might have been with Cockroach for a little while, you'll notice that with every single release, we're always focusing on adding more SQL functionality, improving query observability, more compatibility with different developer tools. This is really core to our product development. And for this particular release, we have a bunch of those new updates as well. And I'm just wondering, Michael, what do you think developers should sort of take away from these updates in general at a high level?
Yeah, I think, again, it's unblocking sort of the developer productivity here. So just working from the bottom up, right? Interoperability with the tools that you're familiar with, that you prefer, that you love developing with. We want to meet you where that is, right? So that's not a barrier to you using our product and being productive with it. Observability as well. I think the ability to sort of quickly narrow in on what is causing a query to become less optimal, or trimming off some of that excess in terms of indexes that aren't providing value to you. And then also just in terms of functionality, sort of what are the things the database can be doing for you in terms of jobs that the database really should be doing for you. And so we're always incrementally adding functionality as well, based on customer feedback and people who are using it and saying, hey, this would be really helpful for me.
Yeah, and then when it comes to the specific new SQL functionality that we added, did you know why we focused on this particular syntax or these particular updates?
Yeah, I think without going too much detail into each of those, each of these came directly from compiled customer feedback. So customers who we've talked to that said, hey, this would really be helpful. And the on update one, for example, in particular, a lot of people have these TTL-like workloads where they're writing data, and after a certain amount of time, you need to age it out. The on update functionality really allows you to be able to set that timestamp so that you can create an application or a script or something that helps you on some occasion vacuum that data. So I think that was one where we really heard from customers that this is something that would be valuable. And so we decided to invest in it because we saw the value as well.
Mm-hmm. And that update is sort of a workaround to triggers, right? Which is a feature that is not available in Cockroach. And
that's right.
Something that we hear requested a lot.
We do hear a lot. Triggers are not generally available, but you can argue that this on update is a trigger, but just one with a sort of a narrower, I guess, utility.
Mm-hmm. And then when it comes to the improved observability, so how do these updates help developers with troubleshooting their application performance?
Yeah, I think, previously, for example, our SQL metrics were not persisted to disk. They were stored in memory. And so you didn't get this sort of time series view. Now you can see, oh, my P50 on this query went up. Oh, this correlates with this change, or this schema change, or this bump in CPU. And so really being able to allow you to diagnose these problems and address them, as opposed to sort of the frustration that comes with lingering issues. Index usage stats are in particular very interesting, but I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in the demo on the value of that. And the last one is in terms of meeting you where you are, right? So in terms of being able to access the information you need when you're in the SQL shell, which is a place where a lot of people are when they're, developing on a day-to-day or diagnosing a particular issue. But in particular, Cockroach supports serializable isolation, and that's it. And a lot of people are coming from lower levels of isolation where transaction contention is less of an issue. So we've invested in a lot of visibility into contention that allow you to unblock the throughput that you need to hit for your application's goals.
Yeah, and it looks like we have a question in the Q&A from Nicholas. Michael, do you want to give that a quick read? It's about whether we're developing compatibility with the ORM entity framework.
Yeah, I don't actually know if we're integrating with EF, but and what our status is there. But I think we've captured your information, and I'll reach out to the product manager who owns this area to reach out to you with the current status of that.
Cool, thank you. And that's kind of a good segue into that last section of updates there about compatibility with tools. So it is great to hear from you, Nicholas. So thanks for posting your question. We do really appreciate hearing from users on the ORMs that they use and that they want to see compatibility with. So, in general, how do we prioritize these decisions, Michael?
Yeah, so it is very much who we hear from, right? And it's based on market demand and market feedback. I think there are a core set of ORMs that are just very, very popular, and we started out focusing on those. But as we're starting to sort of get a broader collective of ORMs, schema change managers, schema migration tools to sort of user feedback. And so the two means of feedback that we've seen customers have, one is via our GitHub and asking for support there, but also going to the tools that you love. Many of them have sort of issue requests processes as well. And we've seen that that has been a big driver of those maintainers taking up CockroachDB as a project as well. And we work closely with those maintainers specifically when we do decide to go down the path of first-class support there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Sometimes the development is happening on our end, sometimes it's happening on the end of the tool, sometimes both, but we do work very closely with them. All right, so I know we have another demo queued up for this area of updates. So I'm going to pass it back over to you, Michael.
And I apologize in advance. The text may be a little hard to show because this is a previously recorded video from one of my colleagues.
Hi everyone, so for this video, we'll be doing a high-level overview of the index usage statistics feature for 21.2. First, we'll provide some high-level context on what it is, and then we'll dive into a quick demo. So index usage statistics basically enables developers to quickly determine if they have any unused or infrequently used indexes within their workload. Previously, before, to identify these indexes, it was a very, very manual and tedious process where you had to comb through multiple explain plans, do a string match on various indexes within your workload to see if what indexes are or aren't being used for your active workload. Why is this an important practice? It's important because for every single index you have within on your particular table, you are incurring additional write overhead when inserting or updating that particular table. And if there's no read benefit for that particular index, you're better off just dropping it, right? Because you're always paying a penalty for every single write to that particular table. So for index usage stats, we are now capturing all reads that are happening on a particular table index, where you want to drop indexes that have very little reads or no reads, so that you can improve your write performance of your workload. So first, let's now dive into a quick demo. I'm going to pull up the secret CLI view here that I have set up. But first, I'm going to show all the tables in our CockroachDB internal schema. As you can see here, I have the index usage stats table, where now I'll show the table schema itself. So show create table. as you see, has a very simple schema, but basically it has table ID, index ID, total reads, and last read, right? So you can look at total reads and see any indexes or secondary indexes that are created with 0 total reads. Those are candidates to drop. You can also look at the last reads. So if you do have total reads, but the last read is far in the past, that's also a candidate to drop as well. It tells you that your workload has drifted or changed, where you now have an unused index that is incurring overhead for your workload. So with that, I will now show a pretty handy query that we have in our documentation as well within the performance tuning recipe part of our docs. So in this case here, we now have a pretty handy query that joins our CockroachDB internal table indexes with our CockroachDB internal index usage stats to pull the actual table names as well for a much more convenient view of which tables or which indexes to drop, right? So you can't drop primary indexes, but you can see here, this is the TPCC workload. It's pretty optimized where all of the indexes or secondary indexes that have been created do have hits here, right? So this is a pretty optimized indexing strategy here where these indexes were recently read, and also there are quite a few hits as well. So when using this particular query, you want to look at any secondary indexes that have a total reads of 0, or as I mentioned before, it has reads, but if it's far in the past, these are candidates to drop.
And so special thanks to my colleague, Kevin, who put that video together, and just reiterating the value of that, right? A lot of database technologies, the overhead of an additional index is not super high, but with sort of CockroachDB, again, each additional index can incur write overhead. And so the ability to understand which indexes are really providing value is sort of is very useful in terms of tuning the performance of your cluster.
Yeah, and it was a good demo. It sounds like we're also getting some feedback. The text was a little small, which we were sort of aware of, but I think that we could probably actually attach a link to that video in the follow-up email. So if you want to go ahead and just watch it on your own time and see what the text in the terminal says, that would be a solution there. So we'll make sure we include it in the follow-up email. All right, and we're going to go back to slides for the final group of updates. All right, so the last bucket of updates we have here is all about operating more easily at very, very large scales. And we made improvements to backup and recovery, these two pieces of functionality in 21.2. So I know, Michael, this falls under your product area, very close to home for you. What can you say about these updates that we made, and why did we focus on them for this release?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's happened is our customers are really pushing the limits in larger workloads, and often the larger workloads at companies are the most important. And one of the things about disaster recovery is the more important it is, the more important your sort of RPO and RTO and your ability to recover the data is. And so we invested in a lot to sort of create these guardrails around making sure that the efficiency of backup and the efficiency of recovery by restore really does scale to the amount of data that you need, and also to the recovery goals that you have. And so these investments are here not just to strengthen the notion of CockroachDB as a resilient database, but this sort of, not really tangible, I don't want to have to think about the resiliency of my database aspect as well, and to really sort of uncork your ability to focus on delivering value and developing that application for your customers.
Yeah, and like you were saying, this really goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning of the session, where it's really exciting that we have these customers that are running massive workloads on CockroachDB and that are really pushing the limits, and it's letting us have the ability and the excuse and to focus on making sure Cockroach is functioning as great as possible at these huge scales. So it's all exciting stuff here.
Absolutely.
And anyone have any more questions, since that's most of the material we have to cover today? You can drop them in the Q&A or the chat. And we have Michael here who knows a lot and can answer anything. All right, well, feel free to follow up over Slack, over our community Slack, if you want to learn any more and where to go from here. So CockroachDB 21.2 is available right now. You can get started on our dedicated cloud solution, CockroachDB Dedicated, or you can just download the binary and play around with it yourself on your computer with CockroachDB self-hosted. And we also have a lot of other resources to learn more. So the release notes in our docs are great. The docs team does such a good job of going over all the details of what's new. We have some great blog posts on change data capture that our product manager Abby wrote, who's on Michael's team. We have a good piece on database contention, which goes back to some of the query observability. And just, yeah, definitely check that out. So it looks like we have one more question that came up. You see the question in the chat, Michael?
Yeah, so in terms of a job scheduler, the job scheduler right now is not, it is an internal framework, not an externally exposed framework. And what I mean by that is we've used the job scheduling framework to schedule, to expose specific types of jobs to be scheduled, but then also schedule some of our internal jobs. So the two right now that I'm aware of are, you can create a schedule for taking backups. And we see that very, very commonly used. Most of the customers that I interact with directly are using schedules to schedule backup jobs. But then the other is our internal auto stats. So updating our table statistics to ensure that our optimizer is picking the most efficient plan, that is now migrated to that jobs framework. But I am curious, is there anything in particular you would hope from a job scheduling system? What kind of, for lack of a better word, jobs are you trying to solve for with such a tool?
Yeah, and you can feel free to add that in the chat, or we can also follow up later over email. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is that a few weeks ago, or I think it's a few months ago at this point, time is moving very quickly, we released CockroachDB serverless, and it is now in beta. So this is a completely serverless consumption method for CockroachDB. It is auto-scaling, consumption-based pricing with a pretty big free tier. No credit card required to get started. So if you do want to try out CockroachDB, this is the way we're recommending everyone give it a try these days. And it looks like we did have one more follow-up from the discussion we were just having, Michael. Any more information you can provide there?
Yeah, I think it'll really depend on what type of in terms of what you're trying to schedule, I guess. I think one of the history behind why we chose to create a scheduled jobs framework and it was primarily, we built it to be extensible, but we primarily built it to solve the backup problem, where if you're triggering backups from an external system, how can we make sure that that's as resilient as the cluster itself? If you have, a cron job sitting on a single machine, that's a single point of failure, whereas the whole, ethos and purpose and value, one of the large value propositions of CockroachDB is distributed and resilient. And so what we've done is the scheduler itself is also resilient to the same things that the database itself is resilient to, to node failures, to, ephemeral blips, network outages. So it really is there. That was really the reason why we decided to build sort of an internal scheduler. The other thing sounds like CR controls, reorgs, and stats. I'm not fully clear on what you're insinuating there. I'm happy to answer questions if you want to follow up on that quickly. Back to the question from, I believe it was Nicholas on Entity Framework. The PM just pinged me back, and I think she said that work on Entity Framework is in progress for this current release. I think always, subject to, we're working with a contractor on that one. So, subject to progress on that, but progress is underway on it.
Cool. All right, so let's take any more questions offline. We can always follow up over email. I think we can do that, Michael. And thank you everyone so much for joining today. Please fill out the survey at the end and keep an eye out for the recordings that we're going to send over. So, all right, thank you.